Delighted to introduce a short presentation, a version of which I gave at the launch of my new book, The Clarinet, at my wonderful publishers, Faber Music, quite recently. What you just heard was the opening of a little fanfare I wrote especially for the occasion, and a few pictures of what was a lovely evening. So what follows now is just a short talk, very short talk, about a little bit about the background of this book and what's in it. Well, it all actually began when Leslie and Richard from Faber came round to see me one afternoon, and we just discussed the idea of doing quite a comprehensive book on playing the clarinet. The actual writing of it started maybe slightly unusually, and interestingly, it was this chap who was responsible. And when he told us all that you must stay at home, I thought, well, I've got quite a lot of time now with all this time to spare. Let's use it profitably and write this book. And I think pretty much for the next 3 months or so, I spent a lot of time, maybe up to 8 hours a day, working on this, and pretty much got this book together. A lot more work was required afterwards, but put the main shape of it together, and it was really quite an exciting time. And maybe one of the most interesting and helpful things was that loads of other people all over the world were also stuck inside, and I was able to get in touch with them. And here you can see my list of thank yous, and many people. I can't, unfortunately, won't thank everyone now individually, but if you're on that list, thank you enormously. Many people gave me so much help, many scientific friends, because I've done a lot of work on the science of the instrument, some of it I think which has never really been done before in the way that we kind of thought it through, and many clarinet friends have helped enormously, so thank you all very much. I do want to pick out one or two people though, if I may, and the first really is John Davis. John Davis was my teacher, and an absolutely wonderful man. He taught me so much, and so many other people. He taught so many people so much. He taught them not only to play the clarinet, but that life is all about sharing and generosity and wonderful qualities. The picture on the right is John as a young man in his duo with Elsa Cross, who was a wonderful lady. She was in fact the last surviving pupil of Webern, I think, and a great pianist. And on the left is John, more recently, he's died now sadly, but more recently at a Faber gathering. And also in that picture there's Richard, who is the CEO of Faber and a huge supporter. So thanks to them enormously for making this happen. Just a little bit on the science. I got very interested in some very complicated papers on playing the clarinet by an Australian acoustic clarinetist who actually runs the department in the University of New South Wales, Joe Wolfe, and I read some papers by him, and eventually I actually sent him an email wondering whether or not he might get in touch, and he did, and we had some very interesting exchange of emails talking about all sorts of complicated things that I really didn't understand, but do to some extent now, and hopefully have included in an understandable way in the book. Sarah Upjohn was also terribly helpful. Sarah is a physiotherapist who works at many musical institutions and helped a lot with all sorts of aspects related to the body, which of course, the hour side of the clarinet, which I talk about an awful lot. Ed Pillinger, who is one of the world's great mouthpiece makers, helped an awful lot on all things to do with the area of the clarinet. Told me a wonderful thing actually in one of our conversations, was that he'd set up this extraordinary experiment where he'd created a sort of a mechanical embouchure attached to a mouthpiece, and the clarinet would work without any air actually moving down the instrument, and of course that got a lot of interesting thoughts came out of that. Two more really wonderful people. This, I hope you'll recognise, is the great Carl Leister, one of my absolute heroes. That's Carl sitting in my kitchen, in fact, talking to me about the Debussy Rhapsody. One of the greatest players, was in the Berlin Philharmonic for 34 years, I think, still going strong. And he and I discussed many things in terms of the more musical side of playing. And here is Philippe Coupé, one of the great French players. And he was very much responsible for a very particular part of this book, which I'll come back to later. Also, another one of my boyhood heroes was Stanley Drucker, in the New York Phil for an amazing 61 years. And I wondered whether Stanley was still about. And I discovered not only was he about, I found his agent, wrote to his agent, and the next morning I got an email from the great Stanley Drucker. And we had a number of wonderful conversations about all sorts of things, particularly about playing the clarinet in an orchestra for 61 years. Anyway, that was fascinating. So here's the book. So many months later, the book. And I just wanted to draw attention to the cover. And when Richard King, who's CEO of Faber, first saw this cover, he, I think, said, could we get that photo a little bit cleaner? Because he didn't actually know that it was a painting. And it's an amazing painting by my wonderful friend and clarinetist and pupil Georgina Lee. And it is amazing, isn't it? And it gives such a character, I think, to the book. So in this next little bit, I just want to show you what's in the book, and just by giving you the title page for most of the chapters and a tiny bit of what goes on inside. Be prepared. Obviously, we start and we are prepared, and we talk about loads of aspects of warming up both the body and the mind, and it goes into a lot of detail. And I had a lot of help here by various scientists of one sort or another to make sure that it's all absolutely there. A big chapter on making the sound, and of course there's a lot about breathing, and a lot about what the Americans call voicing, fascinating area of playing, which we don't do that much of, certainly here in the UK, but there's a lot about the oral cavity and voicing and that whole area of clarinet playing. And then it goes on yet another chapter about developing tone and talking about it in all sorts of interesting ways. And I just want to draw your attention to one little bit, which is this bit I call useful words. It's interesting when we talk about tone, is the words we use. How can we talk about tone and find words that will actually allow people to think about the sound that they're making? So I came up with all these words, some of which we know and we use, but some which maybe we don't use so much, plus their opposites, their antonyms. And I hope this gives us a kind of a vocabulary of tone, a vocabulary of words we can use to help ourselves and our pupils to think about the sound we create. Intonation was a fascinating area to talk about, and there's lots of interesting ideas here. And again, one particular bit I thought was interesting is the difference between just intonation and tempered intonation, and the difference really. This shows the difference between tempered intonation, how a piano might be tuned, and just pure intonation. And of course, most of this is impossible. Like, for example, a true major second is 4 cents, 4 parts in 100, sharper than a tempered major second. But a minor second is lower by 29, nearly 30 parts in 100. That is definitely audible. And some of the others, a minor seventh is actually sharper than a tempered minor seventh. Isn't that interesting? So to create really pure intonation, I thought it's quite interesting to know about this stuff. And there's lots of other interesting bits here. A major long chapter about articulation, which talks about different kinds of articulation, but also different kinds of accentuation, and how that relates. And for example, I spent quite a time talking to Carl Leister about this. And just to give you one example, the accent mark in the German tradition, it is not really adding a dynamic emphasis, but more an expressive emphasis to a note. And that kind of is very significant when we think about Brahms and other composers writing in the Germanic tradition. Obviously a long chapter and loads of exercises and ideas about fingering and finger work, and there's a lot throughout the book. There's lots of examples from the solo, chamber and orchestral repertoire to explore in detail. There's a section on performance, bringing the music to life, playing with style, etc. And I've given some interesting thoughts here. Things like problems caused by food and drink that you might eat or drink before a performance, the effect they have, dry mouths, all sorts of interesting things there to discuss. And then a bit on the instrument itself, where we talk about reeds and the mouthpiece and the instrument, and a lot about stuff that I knew about but didn't know in a lot of detail, like facing curves and how we can understand it in a way that is understandable, and how it can affect our playing. A lot about that. And although this is called Further Information, it's actually got some of the most really interesting stuff near the back of the book. We have a history timeline, and thanks very much to Michael Bryant, one of the great gurus of the clarinet today, if not the greatest, who helped me with this. That's really basically all we give on history. But one bit I'd like to just draw out. I wonder whether you knew this. 1969, the crew of Apollo 10 took the first music to play on the moon, and the first piece played on the moon, quite understandably, was Stranger on the Shore, which of course the great Akerbilk works. So the first instrument that the moon beings ever heard was the clarinet. Isn't that nice to know? And another area which I thought was really useful is that we've given durations of each movement of all the main clarinet works. I don't think anyone's ever done this before. Sat down with a number of recordings, made a note, and then took an average. So it's an average of the way most people play these pieces, and I think very useful. I think for exams, auditions, concerts, recitals, whatever, to be able to look this up and find out the length of your piece. And one of my most favourite pages is this, Clarinet Dynasties. Who was your teacher's teacher and your teacher's teacher's teacher? And it's fascinating, and you can find all sorts of wonderful links. And I'm sure there's a kind of clarinet DNA that's passed down from one teacher to another. I didn't quite know how it works, but my teacher, obviously, as I said before, was John Davis, and you can see he doesn't go back very far, actually, because he goes back to Lazarus, who was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, British player of the 19th century, only by 3 degrees of separation, because both John and his teacher, George Anderson, and Lazarus lived into their 80s and 90s. I also had some lessons when I was at the Academy with Georgina Debray. And through Georgina, we can trace right back to the Lefebvre brothers, Jean-Xavier Lefebvre, who wrote all those wonderful sonatas, and back to Joseph Beer, who is known as the father of French playing. And it's amazing. So there must be some kind of DNA passed from one to another that still must be there. And it was Philip Coupé who absolutely helped me enormously with that. One other thing at the launch of the book was that we also launched the International Clarinet Community, a Facebook site. And here are our objectives of the International Clarinet Community. I'll just leave that there for a minute for you to look at. The idea basically is to raise awareness of the instrument and inspire more people to take it up, because it is a wonderful instrument, the clarinet. It makes a wonderful sound. It's got wonderful music in its repertoire. And it's a wonderful instrument to play. I love the actual sensation of playing the clarinet, the feeling you get when you're making the sound, and I want other people to enjoy it as well. So there it is, a little introduction to this book, this kind of compendium to clarinet playing, mostly about how to play the instrument, but with other bits and pieces as well, which I hope that you'll find, if you do get a copy, very helpful and useful. Thanks so much for listening.